America hadn't cared enough either. No one had cared enough. The world closed its doors, and 6 million Jews were slaughtered. What a world! What an insane world! "What do we have left to us now, if not American Jewry?" he said. "Some Jews say we should wait for God to send the Messiah. We cannot wait for God. We must make our own Messiah. We must rebuild American Jewry, and Palestine must become a Jewish homeland. We have suffered enough. How long must we wait for the Messiah?" It was bad for my father to get excited that way, but there was nothing I could do to stop him. He would talk of nothing else but the destruction of European Jewry. One morning at breakfast, Reb Saunders came out of a brooding silence, sighed, and for no apparent reason began telling us, in a soft sing-song chant, the story of an old pious Hasid who had set out on a journey to Palestine, Eretz Yisroel, Reb Saunders called it, giving the land its traditional name and accenting the E and the Ro, so as to be able to spend the last years of his life in the Holy Land. Finally, he reached the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, and 3 days later he died while praying at the wall for the Messiah to come and redeem his people. Reb Saunders swayed slowly back and forth as he told the story, and when he was done, I sat quietly, not mentioning my father's name, that a lot of people were now saying that it was time for Palestine to become a Jewish homeland, and not only a place where pious Jews went to die. The reaction on the part of the entire family was instantaneous. It was as though someone had thrown a match onto a pile of straw. I could almost feel the heat that replaced the family warmth around the table. Danny went rigid and stared down at the plate in front of him. His brother let out a little whimper, and his sister and mother seemed frozen to their chairs. Reb Saunders stared at me, his eyes suddenly wild with rage, his beard trembling, and he pointed a finger at me that looked like a weapon. "Who are these people? Who are these people?" he shouted in Yiddish, and the words went through me like knives. "Apikorsim, Goyim. Ben-Gurion and his Goyim will build Eretz Yisroel. They will build for us a Jewish land. They will bring Torah into this land. Goyishkeit they will bring into the land, not Torah. God will build the land, not Ben-Gurion and his Goyim. When the Messiah comes, we will have Eretz Yisroel, a holy land, not a land contaminated by Jewish Goyim." I sat there stunned and terrified, engulfed by his rage. His reaction had caught me so completely by surprise that I had quite literally stopped breathing, and now I found myself gasping for breath. I felt as if I were being consumed by flames. The silence that followed his outburst had a fungus quality to it, as though it were breeding malignancies, and I had the uncanny feeling that I had somehow been stripped naked and violated. I didn't know what to do or say. I just sat there and gaped at him. "The land of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob should be built by Jewish Goyim, by contaminated men?" Reb Saunders shouted again. "Never, not while I live. Who says these things? Who says we should now build Eretz Yisroel? And where is the Messiah? Tell me, we should forget completely about the Messiah? For this 6 million of our people were slaughtered, that we should forget completely about the Messiah? That we should forget completely about the Master of the universe? Why do you think I brought my people from Russia to America and not to Eretz Yisroel? Because it is better to live in a land of true Goyim than to live in a land of Jewish Goyim. Who says we should build Eretz Yisroel, huh? I'll tell you who says it. Apikorsim say it. Jewish Goyim say it. True Jews do not say such a thing." There was a long silence. Reb Saunders sat in his chair, breathing hard and trembling with rage. "Please, you should not get so angry," Danny's sister pleaded softly. "It is bad for you." "I'm sorry," I said lamely, not knowing what else to say. "Reuven was not talking for himself," Danny's sister said quietly to her father. "He was only—" But Reb Saunders cut her off with an angry wave of his hand. He went rigidly through the grace, then left the kitchen wearing his rage visibly. Danny's sister stared down at the table, her eyes dark and sad. Later, when Danny and I were alone in his room, Danny told me to think 10,000 times the next time I wanted to mention anything like that to his father again. His father was fine, he said, until he was confronted by any idea that he felt came from the contaminated world. "How was I supposed to know that Zionism is a contaminated idea?" I said. "My God, I feel as if I've just been through the 7 gates of hell." "Herzl didn't wear a caftan and side curls," Danny said. "Neither does Ben-Gurion." "You can't be serious." "I'm not talking about myself. I'm talking about my father. Just don't talk about a Jewish state anymore. My father takes God and Torah very seriously, Reuven. He would die for them both quite gladly. A secular Jewish state, in my father's eyes, is a sacrilege, a violation of the Torah. You touched a raw nerve. Please don't do it again. I'm glad I didn't mention it was my father who said it. He might have thrown me out of the house. He would have thrown you out of the house, Danny said grimly. Is he feeling all right? How do you mean? The way he cries all the time like that. Is something wrong? Danny's hand went slowly to an earlock, and I watched him tug at it nervously. 6 million Jews have died, he said. I think he's thinking of them. He's suffering for them. I looked at him. I thought he might be sick. I thought your sister said... He's not sick, Danny broke in. He lowered his hand. I really don't want to talk about it. All right, I said quietly. But I don't think I want to study any Talmud this morning. I'm going to take a long walk. He didn't say anything, but his face was sad and brooding as I went out of his room. When I saw Reb Saunders again at lunch, he seemed to have forgotten the incident completely. But I found myself thinking carefully now before I said anything to him, and I was constantly on my guard with him from that time on. During an afternoon in the last week of July, Danny began talking about his brother. We were sitting in the library, reading, when he suddenly looked up, rested his head in the palm of his right hand, the elbow on the table, and said his eyes were bothering him again, and that he wouldn't be at all surprised if he ended up wearing glasses soon. His brother was having glasses made, and he was only 9. I told him his brother didn't seem to be doing much reading. What did he need glasses for? It has nothing to do with reading, Danny said. His eyes are just plain bad, that's all. Your eyes look bloodshot, I told him. They are bloodshot, he said. Your eyes look as if you've been reading Freud. Ha ha, Danny said. What does Freud say about an ordinary thing like bloodshot eyes? He says to rest them. A genius, I said. You know, my brother's a good kid, Danny said. His sickness is quite a handicap, but everything considered, he's a good kid. He's quiet, I'll say that for him. Does he study at all? Oh, sure. He's bright, too. But he has to be careful. My father can't pressure him. Lucky boy. I don't know. I wouldn't want to be sick all my life. I'd much rather be pressured. He's a nice kid, though. Your sister's pretty nice, too, I said. Danny didn't seem to have heard me, or if he had, he chose to ignore my words completely. He went on talking about his brother. It must really be hell to walk around sick all the time and have to depend upon pills. He's really a sweet kid, and bright, too. He seemed to be rambling, and I wasn't quite sure I knew what he was trying to say. His next words jarred me. He'd probably make a fine tzaddik, he said. I looked at him. How's that again? I said my brother would probably make a fine tzaddik, Danny said quietly. It occurred to me recently that if I didn't take my father's place, I wouldn't be breaking the dynasty after all. My brother could take over. I had talked myself into believing that if I didn't take his place, I would break the dynasty. I think I had to justify to myself having to become a tzaddik. I was frightened and said tightly, Your home hasn't blown up recently, so I take it you haven't told your father. No, I haven't, and I'm not going to either. Not yet. When will you tell him? Because I'm going to be out of town that day. No, he said quietly. I'm going to need you around that day. I was only kidding, I told him, feeling sick with dread. It also occurred to me recently that all my concern about my brother's health was a fake. I don't have much of a relationship with him at all. He's such a kid. I pity him a little, that's all. I was really concerned about his health, because all along I've wanted him to be able to take my father's place. That was something, all right, when I realized that. How am I doing? Are you bored yet? I'm bored stiff, I said. I can't wait until the day you tell your father. You'll wait, Danny said tightly, blinking his eyes. You'll wait, and you'll be around, too, because I'm going to need you. Let's talk about your sister for a change, I said. I heard you the first time. Let's not talk about my sister, if you don't mind. Let's talk about my father. You want to know how I feel about my father? I admire him. I don't know what he's trying to do with me, with this weird silence that he's established between us, but I admire him. I think he's a great man. I respect him and trust him completely, which is why I think I can live with his silence. I don't know why I trust him, but I do. And I pity him, too. Intellectually, he's trapped. He was born trapped. I don't ever want to be trapped the way he's trapped. I want to be able to breathe, to think what I want to think, to say the things I want to say. I'm trapped now, too. You know what it's like to be trapped? I shook my head slowly. "How could you possibly know?" Danny said. "It's the most hellish, choking, constricting feeling in the world. I scream with every bone in my body to get out of it. My mind cries to get out of it, but I can't. Not now. One day I will, though. I want you around on that day, friend. I'll need you around on that day." I didn't say anything. We sat in silence a long time, and then Danny slowly closed the Freud book he had been reading. "My sister's been promised," he said quietly. "What?" "My father promised my sister to the son of one of his followers when she was 2 years old. It's an old Hasidic custom to promise children away. She'll be married when she reaches 18. I think we ought to go over and visit your father now." That was the only time Danny and I ever talked about his sister. A week later, I went up with my father to our cottage near Peekskill. While we were there, America destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki with atomic bombs, and the war with Japan came to an end. I didn't tell my father about that last conversation I had with Danny, and I had many nightmares that year in which Reb Saunders screamed at me that I had poisoned his son's mind. That September, Danny and I entered Hirsch College. I had grown to 5 feet 9 inches, an inch shorter than Danny, and I was shaving. Danny hadn't changed much physically during his last year in high school. The only thing different about him was that now he was wearing glasses. Book 3. A word is worth 1 coin. Silence is worth 2. The Talmud. Chapter 13. By the end of our first week in college, Danny was feeling thoroughly miserable. He had discovered that psychology in the Samson Raphael Hirsch Seminary and College meant experimental psychology only, and that the chairman of the department, Professor Nathan Appelman, had an intense distaste for psychoanalysis in general, and for Freud in particular. Danny was quite vocal about his feelings toward Professor Appelman and experimental psychology. We would meet in the mornings in front of my synagogue and walk from there to the trolley, and for 2 months he did nothing during those morning trolley rides except talk about the psychology textbook he was reading. He didn't say studying, he said reading, with the rats and mazes in the psychology laboratory. "The next thing you know, they'll stick me in with a behaviorist," he lamented. "What do rats and mazes have to do with the mind?" I wasn't sure I knew what a behaviorist was, and I didn't want to make him more miserable by asking him. I felt a little sorry for him, mostly because I had found college to be exciting and was thoroughly enjoying my books and my teachers, while he seemed to be going deeper and deeper into misery. The building that housed the college stood on Bedford Avenue. It was a 6-story white stone building, and it occupied half a block of a busy, store-filled street. The noise of the traffic on the street came clearly through the windows and into our classrooms. Behind the college was a massive brownstone armory, and a block away, across the street, was a Catholic church with a huge cross on its lawn, upon which was the crucified figure of Jesus. In the evenings, a green spotlight shone upon the cross, and we could see it clearly from the stone stairs in front of the college. The street floor of the building consisted of administrative offices, an auditorium, and a large synagogue, a section of which contained chairs and long tables. The entire second floor was a library, a beautiful library, with maze-like stacks that reminded me of the 3rd floor of the library in which Danny and I had spent so much time together. It had bright fluorescent lights that didn't flicker or change color, I noticed immediately the first time I walked in, and a trained professional library staff. It also contained a large reading room with long tables, chairs, a superb collection of reference books, and an oil painting of Samson Raphael Hirsch, which was prominently displayed on a white wall. Hirsch had been a well-known Orthodox rabbi in Germany during the last century, and had fought intelligently through his writings and preachings against the Jewish reform movement of his day. The 3rd and 4th floors had white-painted modern classrooms and large, well-equipped chemistry, physics, and biology laboratories. There were also classrooms on the 5th floor, as well as a psychology laboratory, which contained rats, mazes, screens, and a variety of instruments for the measuring of auditory and visual responses. The 6th floor consisted of dormitory rooms for the out-of-town students. It was a rigidly Orthodox school, with services 3 times a day, and with European-trained rabbis, many of them in long, dark coats, all of them bearded. For the first part of the day, from 9 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon, we studied only Talmud. From 3:15 to 6:15, or 7:15, depending on the schedule of classes we had chosen for ourselves, we went through a normal college curriculum. On Fridays, from 9 to 1, we attended the college. On Sundays, during that same time span, we studied Talmud. I found that I liked this class arrangement very much. It divided my work neatly and made it easy for me to concentrate separately upon Talmud and college subjects. The length of the school day, though, was something else. I was frequently awake until 1 in the morning doing homework. Once my father came into my room at 10 minutes to 1, found me memorizing the section on river flukes from my biology textbook, asked me if I was trying to do 4 years of college all at once, and told me to go to bed right away. I went to bed, half an hour later, when I had finished the memorizing. Danny's gloom and frustration grew worse day by day, despite the fact that the students in his Talmud class looked upon him with open-mouthed awe. He had been placed in Rav Gershonson's class, the highest in the school, and I had been placed one class below. He was the talk of the Talmud department by the end of 2 weeks, and the accepted referee of all Talmudic arguments among the students. He was also learning a great deal from Rav Gershonson, who, as Danny put it, loved to spend at least 3 days on every 2 lines he taught. He had quickly become the leader of the few Hasidic students in the school, the ones who walked around wearing dark suits, stylish shirts, beards, fringes, and earlocks. About half of my high school class had entered the college, and I became friendly enough with many of the other non-Hasidic students. I didn't mix much with the Hasidim, but the extent to which they revered Danny was obvious to everyone. They clung to him as though he were the reincarnation of the Best, as though he were their student tzaddik, so to speak. But none of this made him too happy. None of it was able to offset his frustration over Professor Appelman, who by the time the first semester ended had him so thoroughly upset that he began to talk about majoring in some other subject. He just couldn't see himself spending 4 years running rats through mazes and checking human responses to blinking lights and buzzing sounds, he told me. He had received a B for his semester's work in psychology because he had messed up some math equations on the final examination. He was disgusted. What did experimental psychology have to do with the human mind, he wanted to know. We were in the week between semesters at the time. Danny was sitting on my bed, and I was at my desk, wishing I could help him. He looked so thoroughly sad. But I didn't know a thing about experimental psychology, so there was little I could offer by way of help, except to urge him to stick out the year. Something might come of it. He might even get to like the subject. "Did you ever get to like my father and his planned mistakes?" he asked testily. I shook my head slowly. Reb Saunders had stopped inserting deliberate errors into his Shabbat evening talks the week we had entered college, but the memory of it still rankled. I told Danny that I had disliked the mistake business, and had never really gotten used to it, despite my having witnessed it many times. "So what makes you think sitting long enough through something you hate will get you to like it?" I had nothing to say to that, except to urge him again to stick out the year with Professor Appelman. "Why don't you talk to him about it?" I asked. "About what? About Freud? The one time I mentioned a Freudian theory in class, all I got out of Appelman was that dogmatic psychoanalysis was related to psychology as magic was related to science." Dogmatic Freudians. Danny was imitating Professor Appelman, or so I assumed. I didn't know Professor Appelman, but Danny's voice had taken on a somewhat professorial quality. "Dogmatic Freudians are generally to be regarded as akin to the medieval physicists who preceded the era of Galileo. They are interested solely in confirming highly dubious theoretical hypotheses by the logic of analogy and induction, and make no attempt at refutation or intersubjective testing." That was my introduction to experimental psych. I've been running rats through mazes ever since. Was he right? I asked. Was who right? Professor Appelman. Was he right about what? About Freudians being dogmatic. What followers of a genius aren't dogmatic, for heaven's sake? The Freudians have plenty to be dogmatic about. Freud was a genius. What do they do, make a tzaddik out of him? Very funny, Danny said bitterly. I'm getting a lot of sympathy out of you tonight. I think you ought to have a heart-to-heart talk with Appelman. And tell him what? That Freud was a genius? That I hate experimental psychology? You know what he once said in class? He assumed the professorial air again. "Gentlemen, psychology may be regarded as a science only to the degree to which its hypotheses are subjected to laboratory testing and to subsequent mathematization." Mathematization yet? What should I tell him? That I hate mathematics? I'm taking the wrong course. You should be taking that course, not me. He's right, you know, I said quietly. Who? Appelman. If the Freudians aren't willing to try testing their theories under laboratory conditions, then they are being dogmatic. Danny looked at me, his face rigid. "What makes you so wise about Freudians all of a sudden?" he asked angrily. "I don't know a thing about the Freudians," I told him quietly, "but I know a lot about inductive logic." One of these days, remind me to give you a lecture on inductive logic. If the Freudians... Damn it! Danny exploded. I never even mentioned the followers of Freud in class. I was talking about Freud himself. Freud was a scientist. Psychoanalysis is a scientific tool for exploring the mind. What do rats have to do with the human mind? Why don't you ask Appleman? I said quietly. I think I will, Danny said. I think I'll do just that. Why not? What have I got to lose? It can't make me any more miserable than I am now. That's right, I said. There was a brief silence, during which Danny sat on my bed and stared gloomily down at the floor. How are your eyes these days? I asked quietly. He sat back on the bed, leaning against the wall. They still bother me. These glasses don't help much. Have you seen a doctor? He shrugged. He said the glasses should do it. I just have to get used to them. I don't know. Anyway, I'll talk to Appleman next week. The worst that could happen is I drop the course. He shook his head grimly. What a miserable business. 2 years of reading Freud, and I have to end up doing experimental psychology. You never know, I said. Experimental psychology might come in handy someday. Oh, sure. All I need to do is get to love mathematics and rats. Are you coming over this Saturday? I'm studying with my father Shabbat afternoon, I told him. Every Saturday afternoon? Yes. My father asked me last week if you were still my friend. He hasn't seen you in 2 months. I'm studying Talmud with my father, I said. You review? No, he's teaching me scientific method. Danny looked at me in surprise, then grinned. You're planning to try scientific method on Rav Schwartz? No, I said. Rav Schwartz was my Talmud teacher. He was an old man with a long gray beard, who wore a black coat and was constantly smoking cigarettes. He was a great Talmudist, but he had been trained in a European yeshiva, and I didn't think he would take kindly to the scientific method of studying Talmud. I had once suggested a textual emendation in class, and he had given me a queer look. I didn't think he even understood what I had said. Well, good luck with your scientific method, Danny told me, getting to his feet. Just don't try it on Rav Gershenson. He knows all about it and hates it. When will my father get to see you? I don't know, I said. I've got to go home. What's your father doing in there? The sound of my father's typewriter had been clearly heard throughout the time we had been talking. He's finishing another article. Tell him my father sends his regards. Thanks. Are you and your father talking to each other these days? Danny hesitated a moment before answering. Not really. Only now and then. It's not really talking. I didn't say anything. I think I'd really better go home, Danny said. It's late. I'll meet you in front of your shul Sunday morning. Okay. I walked him to the door, then stood there listening to the tapping of his metal-capped shoes on the hallway floor. He went out the double door and was gone. I came back to my room and found my father standing in the doorway that led to his study. He had a bad cold and was wearing a woolen sweater and a scarf around his throat. This was his 3rd cold in 5 months. It was also the first time in weeks that he had been home at night. He had become involved in Zionist activities and was always attending meetings where he spoke about the importance of Palestine as a Jewish homeland and raised money for the Jewish National Fund. He was also teaching an adult studies course in the history of political Zionism at our synagogue on Monday nights, and another adult course in the history of American Jewry at his yeshiva on Wednesday nights. He rarely got home before 11. I would always hear his tired steps in the hallway as he came in the door. He would have a glass of tea, come into my room, and chat with me for a few minutes, telling me where he had been and what he had done that night. Then he would remind me I didn't have to do 4 years of college all at once, I should go to bed soon, and he would go into his study to prepare for the classes he would be teaching the next day. He had begun taking his teaching with almost ominous seriousness these past months. He had always prepared for his classes, but there was a kind of heaviness to the way he went about preparing now, writing everything down, rehearsing his notes aloud, as if he were trying to make certain that nothing of significance would remain unsaid, as if he felt the future hung on every idea he taught. I never knew when he went to sleep. No matter what time I got to bed, he was still in his study. He had never regained the weight he had lost during the weeks he had spent in the hospital after his heart attack, and he was always tired, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes watery. He stood now in the doorway to his study, wearing the woolen sweater, the scarf, and the round black skull cap. His feet were in bedroom slippers, and his trousers were creased from all the sitting over the typewriter. He was visibly tired, and his voice cracked a few times, as he asked me what Danny had been so excited about. He had heard him through the door, he said. I told him about Danny's misery over Professor Appleman and experimental psychology. He listened intently, then came into my room and sat down on my bed with a sigh. "So," he said, "Danny is discovering that Freud is not God." I told him at least to talk it over with Professor Appleman. "And?" "He'll talk to him next week." Experimental psychology, my father mused. "I know nothing about it. He said there was a lot of math in it." "Ah, and Danny does not like mathematics. He hates it, he says. He's feeling pretty low. He feels he wasted 2 years reading Freud." My father smiled and shook his head, but remained silent. "Professor Appleman sounds a lot like Professor Flesser," I said. Professor Abraham Flesser was my logic teacher, an avowed empiricist, and an enemy of what he called obscurantist continental philosophies, which, he explained, included everything that had happened in German philosophy, from Fichte to Heidegger, with the exception of Wehlinger and 1 or 2 others. My father wanted to know what it was the 2 professors had in common, and I told him what Professor Appleman had said about psychology being a science only to the extent to which its hypotheses can be mathematized. "Professor Flesser made the same remark once about biology," I said. "You talk about biology in a symbolic logic class?" my father asked. "We were discussing inductive logic." "Ah, of course. The point about mathematizing hypotheses was made by Kant. It is one of the programs of the Vienna Circle logical positivists." "Who?" "Not now, Reuben. It is too late and I am tired. You should go to sleep soon. Take advantage of the nights when you have no schoolwork." "You'll be working late tonight, Abba?" "Yes." "You're not taking care of yourself, you know. Your voice sounds awful." He sighed again. "It is a bad cold," he said. "Does Dr. Grossman know you're working so hard?" "Dr. Grossman worries a little bit too much about me," he said, smiling. "Are you going for another checkup soon?" "Soon," he said. "I'm feeling fine, Reuben. You worry like Dr. Grossman. Worry better about your schoolwork. I am fine." "How many fathers do I have?" I asked. He didn't say anything, but he blinked his eyes a few times. "I wish you'd take it a little easy," I said. "This is not a time to take things easy, Reuben. You read what is happening in Palestine." I nodded slowly. "This is a time to take things easy?" my father asked, his hoarse voice rising. "The Haganah and Irgun boys who die are taking it easy?" He was talking about what was now going on in Palestine. 2 Englishmen, an army major and a judge, had been kidnapped recently by the Irgun, the Jewish terrorist group in Palestine, and were being held as hostages. A captured member of the Irgun, Dov Gruner, had been sentenced to hanging by the British, and the Irgun had announced instant retaliation against these hostages should the sentence be carried out. This was the latest of a growing list of terrorist activities against the British Army in Palestine. While the Irgun engaged in terror, blowing up trains, attacking police stations, cutting communications lines, the Haganah continued smuggling Jews through the British naval blockade in defiance of the British Colonial Office, which had sealed Palestine off to further Jewish immigration. Rarely did a week go by now without a new act of terror against the British. My father would read the newspaper accounts of these activities, and I could see the anguish in his eyes. He hated violence and bloodshed, and had an intense distaste for the terrorist policy of the Irgun, but he hated the British non-immigration policy even more. Irgun blood was being shed for the sake of a future Jewish state, and he found it difficult to give voice to his feelings of opposition to the acts of terror that were regularly making front-page headlines now. Invariably, the headlines spurred him on to new bursts of Zionist activity and to loud, excited justification of the way he was driving himself in his fundraising and speech-making efforts in behalf of a Jewish state. I could see he was beginning to get excited now, too, so to change the subject quickly, I told him Reb Saunders had sent his regards. "He wonders why he doesn't see me," I said. But my father didn't seem to have heard me. He sat on the bed, lost in thought. We were quiet for a long time. Then he stirred and said softly, "Reuven, do you know what the rabbis tell us God said to Moses when he was about to die?" I stared at him. "No," I heard myself say. "He said to Moses, 'You have toiled and labored. Now you are worthy of rest.'" I stared at him and didn't say anything. "You are no longer a child, Reuven," my father went on. "It is almost possible to see the way your mind is growing, and your heart, too. Inductive logic, Freud, experimental psychology, mathematizing hypotheses, scientific study of the Talmud. 3 years ago you were still a child. You have become a small giant since the day Danny's ball struck your eye. You do not see it, but I see it, and it is a beautiful thing to see. So listen to what I'm going to tell you. He paused for a moment, as if considering his next words carefully, then continued. Human beings do not live forever, Reuben. We live less than the time it takes to blink an eye if we measure our lives against eternity. So it may be asked, what value is there to a human life? There is so much pain in the world. What does it mean to have to suffer so much if our lives are nothing more than the blink of an eye? He paused again, his eyes misty now, then went on. I learned a long time ago, Reuben, that a blink of an eye in itself is nothing. But the eye that blinks, that is something. A span of life is nothing. But the man who lives that span, he is something. He can fill that tiny span with meaning, so its quality is immeasurable, though its quantity may be insignificant. Do you understand what I'm saying? A man must fill his life with meaning. Meaning is not automatically given to life. It is hard work to fill one's life with meaning. That I do not think you understand yet. A life filled with meaning is worthy of rest. I want to be worthy of rest when I am no longer here. Do you understand what I'm saying? I nodded, feeling myself cold with dread. That was the first time my father had ever talked to me of his death, and his words seemed to have filled the room with a gray mist that blurred my vision and stung as I breathed. My father looked at me, then sighed quietly. I was a little too blunt, he said. I am sorry. I did not mean to hurt you. I couldn't say anything. I will live for many more years, with God's help, my father said, trying a smile. Between my son and my doctor, I will probably live to be a very old man. The gray mist seemed to part. I took a deep breath. I could feel cold sweat running down my back. Are you angry at me, Reuben? I shook my head. I did not want to sound morbid. I only wanted to tell you that I am doing things I consider very important now. If I could not do these things, my life would have no value. Merely to live, merely to exist. What sense is there to it? A fly also lives. I didn't say anything. The mist was gone now. I found the palms of my hands were cold with sweat. I am sorry, my father said quietly. I can see I upset you. You frightened me, I heard myself say. I am sorry. Will you please go for that checkup? Yes, my father said. You really frightened me talking that way. Are you sure you're all right? I have a bad cold, my father said, but I am fine otherwise. You'll go for that checkup? I will call Dr. Grossman tomorrow and make an appointment for next week, all right? Yes, fine. My young logician is satisfied. Good. Let us talk of happier things. I did not tell you that I saw Jack Rose yesterday. He gave me $1,000 check for the Jewish National Fund. Another $1,000? Jack Rose and my father had been boyhood friends in Russia and had come to America on the same boat. He was now a wealthy furrier and a thoroughly non-observant Jew. Yet 6 months ago, he had given my father a $1,000 contribution to our synagogue. It is strange what is happening, my father said, and it is exciting. Jack is on the building committee of his synagogue. Yes, he joined a synagogue. And not for himself, he told me, for his grandchildren. He is helping them put up a new building so his grandchildren can go to a modern synagogue and have a good Jewish education. It is beginning to happen everywhere in America. A religious renaissance, some call it. I can't see Jack Rose in a synagogue, I said. On the few occasions when he had been over to our apartment, I had found his open disregard for Jewish tradition distasteful. He was a short man with round pink features, always immaculately dressed, always smoking long, expensive cigars. Once I asked my father why they had remained friends. Their views about almost everything of importance were so different. He replied by expressing dismay at my question. Honest differences of opinion should never be permitted to destroy a friendship, he told me. Haven't you learned that yet, Reuben? Now I was tempted to tell my father that Jack Rose was probably using his money to salve a bad conscience. But I didn't. Instead, I said, a little scornfully, I don't envy his rabbi. My father shook his head soberly. Why not? You should envy him, Reuben. American Jews have begun to return to the synagogue. God help us if synagogues fill up with Jack Roses. They will fill up with Jack Roses, and it will be the task of rabbis to educate them. It will be your task if you become a rabbi. I looked at him. If you become a rabbi, my father said, smiling at me warmly. When I become a rabbi, you mean? My father nodded, still smiling. You would have been a fine university professor, he said. I would have liked you to become a university professor, but I think you have already decided. Am I right? Yes, I said. Even with a synagogue full of Jack Roses? Even with a synagogue full of Jack Roses, I said. God help me. America needs rabbis, my father said. Well, it's better than being a boxer, I told him. My father looked puzzled. A bad joke, I said. Will you have some tea with me? I said I would. Come, let us have some tea and continue to talk about happy things. So we drank tea and talked some more. My father told me about the Zionist activities he was engaged in, the speeches he was making, the funds he was raising. He said that in a year or two, the crisis in Palestine would come to a head. There would be terrible bloodshed, he predicted, unless the British would give over the problem to the United Nations. Many American Jews were not yet aware of what was going on, he said. The English papers did not tell the entire story. A Jew had to read the Yiddish press now if he wished to know everything that was happening in Palestine. American Jews had to be awakened to the problem of a Jewish state. His Zionist group was planning a mass rally in Madison Square Garden, he told me. The publicity would be going out this week, and there would be a large ad soon in the New York Times announcing the rally. It was scheduled for late February. I wonder how Reb Saunders will feel when he finds out that Danny is the friend of the son of a Zionist, I mused. I told my father about Reb Saunders' explosion. My father sighed. Reb Saunders sits and waits for the Messiah, he said. I am tired of waiting. Now is the time to bring the Messiah, not to wait for him. We finished our tea. My father returned to his study, and I went to bed. I had some terrible dreams that night, but I could remember none of them when I woke in the morning. It was Friday, and I had nothing planned. Danny always spent his morning studying Talmud, so I decided that rather than waste the day, I would go over to the college library and see if I could find something on experimental psychology. It was a little before 10 o'clock when I woke, and my father had already left to teach, so Manya served me breakfast alone, calling me a lazy sleepyhead and a few other items in Russian which I didn't understand, and then I took the trolley over to the college. The library had a large section devoted to psychology. I found some books on experimental psychology and leafed through them slowly, then checked the indexes and bibliographies. What I discovered made it very clear why Danny was feeling so miserable. I had chosen the books at random, but even a quick glance at them made it apparent that they were all structured along similar lines. They dealt only with experimental data and were filled with graphs, charts, tables, photographs of devices for the measuring of auditory, visual, and tactile responses, and with mathematical translations of laboratory findings. Most of the books didn't even cite Freud in their bibliographies. In one book, Freud was referred to only once, and the passage was far from complimentary. I checked the indexes under unconscious. Some of the books didn't even have it listed. One book had this to say: It is impossible here to discuss the new psychology of the unconscious, but exaggerated as are many of the statements made as to the revelation in psychology caused by psychoanalysis, there is little doubt that it has influenced psychology permanently, and it is well that the teacher should study something of it, partly because of its suggestiveness in many parts of his work, and partly to be on guard against the exaggerated statements of extremists and the uncritical advocacy of freedom from all discipline based upon them. That uncritical advocacy of freedom from all discipline sounded a lot like Professor Appelman. Then I found something that really sounded like Professor Appelman. Magic depends on tradition and belief. It does not welcome observation, nor does it profit by experiment. On the other hand, science is based on experience. It is open to correction by observation and experiment. The book in which I found that passage was full of tables and graphs showing the results of experiments on frogs, salamanders, rats, apes, and human beings. It didn't mention Freud or the unconscious anywhere. I felt sorry for Danny. He had spent 2 years studying about the mind from the point of view of Freudian analysis. Now he was studying about the mind from the point of view of physiology. I understood what he had meant when he said that experimental psychology had nothing to do with the human mind. In terms of psychoanalytic theory, it had very little to do with the human mind. But psychoanalysis aside, I thought the books were very valuable. How else could a science of psychology be built except by laboratory findings? And what else could you do in a laboratory except experiment with the physiology of animals and men? How could you experiment with their minds? How could anyone subject Freud's concept of the unconscious to a laboratory test? Poor Danny, I thought. Professor Appelman, with his experimental psychology, is torturing your mind. And your father, with his bizarre silence, which I still couldn't understand, no matter how often I thought about it, is torturing your soul. I went home, feeling sad and a little helpless. Danny would have to work out his own problem. I couldn't help him much with psychology. The second semester of college began the following Monday, and during lunch, Danny told me he planned to speak to Professor Appleman that afternoon. He looked tense and nervous. I suggested that he be polite but honest, and that he listen to what Appleman might have to say. I was a little nervous myself, but I told him I had done some reading in experimental psychology on Friday, and that I thought it had a lot to contribute. How could you have a science without experimentation, I wanted to know. And how could anyone experiment on the unconscious, which by definition seemed to defy laboratory techniques of testing? I saw Danny become tight-lipped with anger. "Thanks a lot," he said bitterly. "That's just what I need now, a kick in the pants from my best friend." "I'm telling you how I feel," I said. "And I'm telling you how I feel," he almost shouted. "Thanks a million." He stormed angrily out of the lunchroom, leaving me to finish the meal alone. We usually met outside the building after our first class and went home together, but that evening he didn't show up. I waited about half an hour, then went home alone. The next morning, as I walked up Lee Avenue, I saw him waiting for me in front of the synagogue where my father and I prayed. "Where were you last night?" he asked. "I waited half an hour," I said. "What time did you get out?" "7:15. "You were with him an hour?" "We had a long talk. Listen, I'm sorry I blew up like that yesterday at lunch." I told him I had a pretty thick skin, and besides, what was a friend for, if not to be blown up at every now and then? We were walking toward the trolley station. It was a bitter cold morning. Danny's earlocks lifted and fell in the stiff wind that blew through the streets. "What happened?" I asked. "It's a long story," Danny said, looking at me sideways and grinning. "We had a long talk about Freud, Freudians, psychology, psychoanalysis, and God. And he's a very fine person. He said he's been waiting all term for me to talk to him." I didn't say anything, but now I was grinning. Anyway, he knows Freud forwards and backwards. He told me that he wasn't objecting to Freud's conclusions as much as to his methodology. He said Freud's approach was based on his own limited experiences. He generalized on the basis of a few instances, a few private patients. "That's the problem of induction in a nutshell," I said. "How do you justify jumping from a few instances to a generalization?" "I don't know anything about the problem of induction," Danny said. "That's your department. Appleman said something else, though, that made a lot of sense to me. He admitted that Freud was a genius and a cautious scientist, but he said that Freud evolved a theory of behavior based only on the study of abnormal cases. He said that experimental psychology was interested in applying the methodology of the natural sciences to discover how all human beings behaved. It doesn't generalize about personality behavior only on the basis of a certain segment of people. That makes a lot of sense." "Well, well," I said, grinning broadly. He also said his quarrel was mainly with the Freudians, not so much with Freud himself. He said they were happy to earn their fat fees as analysts and refused to let anyone challenge their hypotheses. "There's our trolley," I said. "Come on." The trolley was waiting for a light, and we made it just in time. Some of the people inside stared curiously at Danny as we went up the aisle looking for seats. I had grown accustomed to people staring at Danny, at his beard and side curls, but Danny had become increasingly self-conscious about his appearance ever since the time he had read Gretz on Hasidism. He looked straight ahead, trying to ignore the stares. We found seats in the rear of the trolley and sat down. "So," he said, "analysts don't let anyone challenge their hypotheses," I said. "What happened then?" "So," he said, "analysts don't let anyone challenge their hypotheses," I said. "What happened then?" "Well, we talked a lot about experimental psychology. He told me that it was almost impossible to study human subjects because it was too difficult to control the experiments. He said we use rats because we can vary the conditions. He repeated a lot of things he'd already said in class, but he made a lot more sense this time. At least, I think he made a lot more sense. Maybe after what he said about Freud being a genius, I was just more willing to listen to him. He said he admired my knowledge of Freud, but that in science no one was God, not even Einstein. He said even in religion people differed about what God was, so why shouldn't scientists take issue with other scientists? I couldn't argue with that. He said experimental psychology would be a healthy balance to my knowledge of Freud. Maybe. I still don't think it has anything to do with the human mind. It's more physiology than anything else, I think. Anyway, Appleman told me that if I had any problem with math, he was willing to help me as much as he could. But his time is limited, he said, so he suggested I get a friend to help me on a regular basis. I didn't say anything. He looked at me and grinned. "Okay," I said. "I don't charge very much." "It won't make me love running rats through mazes," Danny said, "but at least he's sympathetic. He's really a fine person." I smiled at him, but didn't say anything. Then I noticed the psychology textbook he was carrying. It was one of the books I had seen on Friday that didn't mention Freud once. I asked him what he thought of it, and he said it was a grind. "If I ever get to love experimental psychology after this book, I'll assume the Messiah has come," he said. "Well, just call on your friendly tzaddik for help," I told him. He looked at me queerly. "I mean me," I said. He looked away and didn't say anything. We rode the rest of the way to school in silence. So I began coaching Danny in math. He caught on very quickly, mostly by memorizing steps and procedures. He wasn't really interested in the why of a mathematical problem, but in the how. I enjoyed coaching him and learned a lot of experimental psychology. I found it fascinating, a lot more substantial and scientific than Freud had been, and a lot more fruitful in terms of expanding testable knowledge on how human beings thought and learned. Throughout the early weeks of February, Danny and I met in the lunchroom, sat at a table by ourselves, and discussed the difficulties he was having with his mathematical translations of psychological experiments. I showed him how to set up his graphs, how to utilize the tables in his textbook, and how to reduce experimental findings to mathematical formulas. I also kept arguing for the value of experimentation. Danny remained convinced of his original argument that experimental psychology had nothing to do with the human mind, though he began to see its value as an aid to learning theory and intelligence testing. His frustration over it went up and down like a barometer, the climate being the extent to which he was able to comprehend and resolve whatever mathematical problem preoccupied him at any given moment. I saw very little of my father during those early weeks of February. Except for breakfast, supper, and Shabbat, he was never home. Sometime between 11 and 12 every night, he would return from wherever he had been, have a glass of tea, spend a few minutes with me in my room, then go to his study. I never knew what time he went to bed, though his tired, stooped body and his haggard face made it clear that he was sleeping very little. He had gone for his checkup, and Dr. Grossman had been satisfied with his health, though he had suggested that he get more rest. My father took a vitamin pill every morning now with his orange juice, but they didn't seem to be doing much good. He completely ignored Dr. Grossman's suggestion that he rest more, and every time I brought up the subject, he either waved it away or talked about the violence now going on in Palestine. It was impossible to talk to him about his health. There was nothing more important to him now than the two ideas around which his life revolved, the education of American Jewry and a Jewish state in Palestine. So he continued teaching his adult classes and planning for the Madison Square Garden rally, due to take place in the last week of February. Not only had my home life been affected by Palestine, but my school life as well. Every shade of Zionist thought was represented in Hirsch College, from the revolutionists who supported the Irgun, to the Neturei Kara, the guardians of the city being Jerusalem. This latter group was composed of severely Orthodox Jews, who, like Reb Saunders, despised all efforts aimed at the establishment of a Jewish state prior to the advent of the Messiah. A recent influx of Hungarian Jews into our neighborhood had swelled their ranks, and they formed a small but highly vocal element of the school's student population. Even the rabbinic faculty was split, most of the rabbis voicing their hope for a Jewish state, some of them opposing it, while all of the college faculty seemed to be for it. There were endless discussions during the afternoon college hours about the problem of dual loyalty. What sort of allegiance could an American Jew have toward a foreign Jewish state? And invariably, these arguments revolved around this hypothetical question. On what side would an American Jew fight, should America ever declare war against a Jewish state? I always answered that the question was silly. America would never send Jews to fight against a Jewish state. During the Second World War, she had sent Japanese Americans to fight the Germans, not the Japanese. But my answer never seemed to satisfy anyone. What if America did want to send Jews to fight against a Jewish state? The theorists countered. What then? The discussions were quite heated at times, but they went on only among those students and teachers who favored a Jewish state. Many of the Hasidim ignored the question completely. Despising as they did all efforts in behalf of a Jewish state, they despised as well all discussions that had to do with even its possible existence. They called such discussions Betel Torah, time taken away from the study of Torah, and looked upon all the disputants with icy disgust. Toward the middle of February, the various factions began to firm up their ranks as the school spectrum of Zionist youth movements moved into the school in a drive for membership, the second such drive since I had entered the college. From that time on, the recruitment drive lasted a few days. Every student's position was clearly defined by the Zionist philosophy of the group he had joined. Most of the pro-Zionist students, myself included, joined a religious Zionist youth group. A few joined the youth arm of the revisionists. The anti-Zionist students remained aloof, bitter, disdainful of our Zionism. In the lunchroom one day, one of the Hasidim accused a member of the revisionist youth group of being worse than Hitler. Hitler had only succeeded in destroying the Jewish body, he shouted in Yiddish, but the revisionists were trying to destroy the Jewish soul. There was almost a fist fight, and the two students were kept apart with difficulty by members of their respective sides. The incident left a bitter taste in everyone's mouth, and succeeded only in increasing the tension between the pro-Zionist and anti-Zionist students. As I expected, Danny did not join any of the Zionist groups. Privately, he told me he wanted to join my group, but he couldn't. Did I remember his father's explosion over Zionism? He wanted to know. I told him I had had nightmares about that explosion. How would I like an explosion like that with every meal? Danny asked me. I didn't think the question required an answer and told him so. Danny nodded grimly. Besides, he added, the anti-Zionists among the Hasidic students looked upon him as their leader. How would it be if he joined a Zionist group? It would do nothing but add to the already existing bitterness. He was trapped by his beard and earlocks, he said, and there was nothing he could do. But one day... He did not finish the sentence. He remained aloof, however, never participating in the quarrels between the pro-Zionist and anti-Zionist groups. And during the near fist fight in the lunchroom, his face went rigid as stone, and I saw him look with hatred at the Hasidic student who had started the quarrel. But he said nothing, and after the disputants had been half carried, half dragged from the lunchroom, he returned immediately to the math problem we had been discussing. In the third week of February, the newspapers reported that British Foreign Minister Bevan had announced his intentions to bring the Palestine issue to the United Nations in September. My father was delighted, despite the fact that the news cost him some extra nights of work, rewriting the speech he was to give at the rally. He read the speech to me the Shabbat afternoon before the rally. In it, he described the 2,000-year-old Jewish dream of a return to Zion, the Jewish blood that had been shed through the centuries, the indifference of the world to the problem of a Jewish homeland, the desperate need to arouse the world to the realization of how vital it was that such a homeland be established immediately on the soil of Palestine. Where else could the remnant of Jewry that had escaped Hitler's ovens go? The slaughter of 6 million Jews would have meaning only on the day a Jewish state was established. Only then would their sacrifice begin to make some sense. Only then would the songs of faith they had sung on their way to the gas chambers take on meaning. Only then would Jewry again become a light to the world, as Ahad Ha'am had foreseen. I was deeply moved by the speech, and I was very proud of my father. It was wonderful to know that he would soon be standing in front of thousands of people, reading the same words he read to me that Shabbat. The day before the scheduled date of the Madison Square Garden rally, there was a violent snowstorm, and my father walked like a ghost through our apartment, staring white-faced out the window at the swirling snow. It fell the entire day, then stopped. The city struggled to free itself of its white burden, but the streets remained choked all the next day, and my father left in the evening for the rally, wearing a look of doom, his face ashen. I couldn't go with him because I had a logic exam the next day and had to remain home to study. I forced myself to concentrate on the logic problems, but somehow they seemed inconsequential to me. I kept seeing my father standing at the rostrum in front of a vast, empty hall, speaking to seats made vacant by the snow. I dreaded the moment I would hear his key in the lock of our apartment door. I did as much studying as I could, hating Professor Flesser for springing the exam on us the way he had done. Then I wandered aimlessly through the apartment, thinking how stupid it was to have all my father's work ruined by something like a snowstorm. Shortly before 1 in the morning, I heard him open the door. I was in the kitchen drinking milk, and I ran out into the hallway. His face was flushed with excitement. The rally had been a wild success. The garden had been packed, and 2,000 people had stood on the street outside, listening to the speeches over loudspeakers. He was elated. We sat at the kitchen table, and he told me all about it. The police had blocked off the street. The crowd's response to the speeches, urging an end to the British mandate and the establishment of a Jewish state, had been overwhelming. My father's talk had been wildly cheered. A senator who had spoken earlier had come up to him after the rally and had enthusiastically shaken his hand, promising him his complete support. There was no question that the rally had been a success. It had been a stunning success, despite the snow-choked streets. It was after 3 in the morning when we finally went to bed. The rally made the front pages of all the New York papers the next day. The English papers carried excerpts of the senator's speech and briefly mentioned my father. but all the Yiddish papers quoted him extensively. I was the center of considerable attention on the part of the Zionist students, and the target of icy hatred from the ranks of the anti-Zionists. I paid no attention to the fact that Danny did not meet me in the lunchroom. Between my fatigue over lack of sleep and my excitement over the rally, I did quite poorly in the logic exam. But I didn't care. Logic didn't seem at all important now. I kept seeing my father's excited face and heard his voice telling me over and over about the rally. That evening I waited for Danny more than half an hour just inside the double door of the school before I decided to go home alone. The next morning he wasn't in front of the synagogue. I waited as long as I could, then took the trolley to school. I was sitting at a table preparing for the Talmud session when I saw him pass me and nod his head in the direction of the door. He looked white-faced and grim, and he was blinking his eyes nervously. He went out, and a moment later I followed. I saw him go into the bathroom, and I went in after him. The bathroom was empty. Danny was urinating into one of the urinals. I stood next to him and assumed the urinating position. Was he all right, I wanted to know? He wasn't all right, he told me bitterly. His father had read the account of the rally in the Yiddish press. There had been an explosion yesterday at breakfast, last night at supper, and this morning again at breakfast. Danny was not to see me, talk to me, listen to me, be found within 4 feet of me. My father and I had been excommunicated from the Saunders family. If Reb Saunders even once heard of Danny being anywhere in my presence, he would remove him immediately from the college and send him to an out-of-town yeshiva for his rabbinic ordination. There would be no college education, no bachelor's degree, nothing, just a rabbinic ordination. If we tried meeting in secret, Reb Saunders would find out about it. My father's speech had done it. Reb Saunders didn't mind his son reading forbidden books, but never would he let his son be the friend of the son of a man who was advocating the establishment of a secular Jewish state run by Jewish goyim. It was even dangerous for Danny to meet me in the bathroom, but he had to tell me. As if to emphasize how dangerous it was, a Hasidic student came into the bathroom just then, took a look at me, and chose the urinal farthest away from me. A moment later, Danny walked out. When I came into the hallway, he was gone. I had expected it, but now that it had happened, I couldn't believe it. Reb Saunders had drawn the line, not at secular literature, not at Freud, assuming he knew somehow that Danny had been reading Freud, but at Zionism. I found it impossible to believe. My father and I had been excommunicated, not only from the Saunders family, apparently, but also from the anti-Zionist element of the Hasidic student body. They avoided all contact with me, and even stepped out of my way so I would not brush against them in the halls. Occasionally I overheard them talking about the Malter Goyim. During lunch I sat at a table with some of my non-Hasidic classmates, and stared at the section of the room the Hasidic students always took for themselves. They sat together in the lunchroom, and my eyes moved slowly over them, over their dark clothes, fringes, beards, and earlocks, and it seemed to me that every word they were saying was directed against me and my father. Danny sat among them, silent, his face tight. His eyes caught mine, held, then looked slowly away. I felt cold with the look of helpless pleading I saw in them. It seemed so incredible to me, so outrageously absurd. Not Freud, but Zionism had finally shattered our friendship. I went through the rest of the day alternating between violent rage at Reb Saunders' blindness and anguished frustration at Danny's helplessness. When I told my father about it that night, he listened in silence. He was quiet for a long time afterward. Then he sighed and shook his head, his eyes misty. He had known it would happen, he said sadly. How could it not happen? I don't understand it, Abba. I was almost in tears. In a million years I'll never understand it. He let Danny read all the books I gave him, let us be friends all these years, even though he knew I was your son. Now he breaks us up over this. I just don't understand it. Reuven, what went on between you and Danny all these years was private. Who really knew? It was probably not difficult for Reb Saunders to answer questions from his followers, assuming there were any questions, which I doubt, simply by saying that I was at least an observer of the commandments. But he has no answer any more to my Zionism. What can he tell his people now? Nothing. He had to do what he did. How could he let you continue to be friends? I am sorry I was the cause of it. I brought you together, and now I am the cause of your separation. I am deeply sorry. He's such a fanatic, I almost shouted. Reuven, my father said quietly, the fanaticism of men like Reb Saunders has kept us alive for 2,000 years of exile. If the Jews of Palestine have an ounce of that same fanaticism and use it wisely, we will soon have a Jewish state. I couldn't say anything else. I was afraid my anger would bring me to say the wrong words. I went to bed early that night, but lay awake a long time, trying to remember all the things Danny and I had done together, since the Sunday afternoon his ball had struck me in the eye. Chapter 14. For the rest of that semester, Danny and I ate in the same lunchroom, attended the same classes, studied the same school synagogue, and often rode in the same trolley car, and never said a single word to each other. Our eyes met frequently, but our lips exchanged nothing. I lost all direct contact with him. It was an agony to sit there in the same class with him, to pass him in the hallway, to see him in a trolley, to come in and out of the school building with him, and not say a word. I grew to hate Reb Saunders with a venomous passion that frightened me at times, and I consoled myself with wild fantasies of what I would do to him if he ever fell into my hands. It was an ugly time, and it began to affect my schoolwork, to a point where some of my college teachers called me into their offices and wanted to know what was happening. They expected better from me than they were receiving. I made vague allusions to personal problems and went away from them cold with despair. I talked about it with my father as often as I could, but there seemed to be little he could do to help me. He would listen somberly, sigh, and repeat that he had no intention of quarreling with Reb Saunders. He respected his position in spite of its fanaticism. I wondered how often during those months whether Danny was also going through these same dreadful experiences. I saw him frequently. He seemed to be losing weight, and I noticed he was wearing different eyeglasses, but he was very carefully avoiding me, and I knew enough to stay away from him. I didn't want word to get back to his father that we had been seen together. I hated the silence between us, and thought it unimaginable that Danny and his father never really talked. Silence was ugly. It was black. It leered. It was cancerous. It was death. I hated it, and I hated Reb Saunders for forcing it upon me and his son. I never knew myself capable of the kind of hatred I felt toward Reb Saunders all through that semester. It became finally a blind, raging fury, and I would find myself trembling with it at odd moments of the day, waiting to get into a trolley car, walking into a bathroom, sitting in the lunchroom, or reading in the library. And my father only added to it, for whenever I began to talk to him of my feelings toward Reb Saunders, he invariably countered by defending him, and by asserting that the faith of Jews like Reb Saunders had kept us alive through 2,000 years of violent persecution. He disagreed with Reb Saunders, yes, but he would countenance no slander against his name or his position. Ideas should be fought with ideas, my father said, not with blind passion. If Reb Saunders was fighting him with passion, that did not mean that my father had to fight Reb Saunders with passion. And Reb Saunders was fighting with passion. He had organized some of the Hasidic Rebbes in the neighborhood into a group called the League for a Religious Eretz Yisrael. The work of this organization had begun mildly enough in early March with the handing out of leaflets. Its aims were clear. No Jewish homeland without the Torah at its center. Therefore, no Jewish homeland until the coming of the Messiah. A Jewish homeland created by Jewish goyim was to be considered contaminated and an open desecration of the name of God. By the end of March, however, the leaflets had become inflammatory in tone, threatening excommunication to all in the neighborhood who displayed allegiance to Zionism, even at one point threatening to boycott neighborhood stores owned by Jews who contributed to, participated in, or were sympathetic with Zionist activities. A mass anti-Zionist rally was announced for a date a few days before Passover. It was poorly attended, but it made some of the English papers, and the reports of what had been said were ugly. The student body of the college was tense with suppressed violence. An angry fistfight broke out in a classroom one afternoon, and it was only because the dean threatened immediate expulsion to any future participants in such quarrels that more fistfights were avoided. But the tension was felt everywhere. It spilled over into our studies, and arguments over Milton, Talleyrand, or deductive procedures in logic were often clear substitutes for the outlawed fistfights over Zionism. I took the finals in the middle of June and came away from them sick with despair. I had botched my midterms badly, and I didn't do too much better on my finals. My father didn't say a word when he saw my report card at the end of June. Both of us were by that time looking forward very eagerly to the quiet month of August, when we would be together in the cottage near Peekskill. It had been a terrible time these past 4 months, and we wanted to get away from the city. But the cottage proved to be not far enough away. We took to it the horrifying news that the Irgun had hanged 2 innocent British sergeants in retaliation for the 3 Irgunists who were hanged on the 29th of July. My father was outraged by the Irgun Act, but said nothing more about it after his first burst of anger. 2 weeks after we left for the cottage, we were back in the city. Urgent Zionist meetings had been called to plan for the coming United Nations session that was to discuss the Palestine problem. My father was on the executive committee of his Zionist group and had to attend the meetings. For the rest of August, I saw my father only on Shabbat. He was gone in the mornings when I woke, and he returned at night when I was asleep. He was filled with fiery excitement, but it was clear that he was wearing himself out. I couldn't talk to him at all about his health. He refused to listen. Our Shabbat afternoon Talmud sessions had stopped. My father spent all of Shabbat resting so as to be prepared for each coming week of furious activity. I haunted the apartment, wandered the streets, barked at Manya, and thought of Danny. I remembered him telling me how much he admired and trusted his father, and I couldn't understand it. How could he admire and trust someone who wouldn't talk to him, even if that someone was his father? I hated his father. Once I even went up to the 3rd floor of the public library, hoping I might find Danny there. Instead, I found an old man sitting in the chair Danny had once occupied, staring nearsightedly at the pages of a scholarly journal. I went away from there and walked the streets blindly until it was time to go home to a lonely supper. In the 2nd week of September, I returned to school for the pre-registration student assembly and found myself sitting in the auditorium a few seats away from Danny. He looked thin and pale and was constantly blinking his eyes. During the registrar's brief words of instruction concerning registration procedure, I saw Danny turn his head, stare at me for a moment, then turn slowly away. His face had remained expressionless. He hadn't even nodded a greeting. I sat very still, listening to the registrar, and felt myself get angry. To hell with you, Danny Saunders, I thought. You could at least show you know I'm alive. To hell with you and your fanatic father. I became so completely absorbed in my anger that I stopped listening to the instructions. I had to ask one of my classmates to repeat them to me after the assembly. To hell with you, Danny Saunders, I kept saying to myself all that day. I can live without your beard and earlocks with no trouble at all. You're not the center of the world, friend. To hell with you and your damn silence. By the time the fall semester officially began 2 days later, I had promised myself to forget Danny as quickly as possible. I wasn't going to let him ruin another semester's work. One more report card like the one I had shown my father at the end of June, and I wouldn't even be graduated cum laude. To hell with you, Danny Saunders, I kept saying to myself. You could have at least nodded your head. But it proved to be a good deal more difficult to forget him than I had anticipated, mostly because I had been moved up into Rev Gershonson's Talmud class, where Danny's presence was always felt. Rav Gershonson was a tall, heavy-shouldered man in his late 60s, with a long, pointed gray beard and thin, tapered fingers that seemed always to be dancing in the air. He used his hands constantly as he talked, and when he did not talk, his fingers drummed on his desk or on the open Talmud in front of him. He was a gentle, kindly person, with brown eyes, an oval face, and a soft voice, which at times was almost inaudible. He was an exciting teacher, though, and he taught Talmud the way my father did, in depth, concentrating for days on a few lines, and moving on only when he was satisfied that we understood everything thoroughly. He laid heavy emphasis on the early and late medieval Talmudic commentators, and we were always expected to come to class knowing the Talmud text and these commentators in advance. Then he would call on one of us to read and explain the text, and the questions would begin. What does the Ramban say about Rabbi Akiva's question? He might ask of a particular passage, speaking in Yiddish. The rabbi spoke only Yiddish in the Talmud class, but the students could speak Yiddish or English. I spoke English. Everyone agrees with the Ramban's explanation? Rav Gershonson might go on to ask. The Meiri does not. Very good. What does the Meiri say? And the Rashba? How does the Rashba explain Abbe's answer? And on and on. There was almost always a point at which the student who was reading the text would become bogged down by the cumulative intricacies of the questions, and would stare down at his Talmud, drowning in the shame produced by his inability to answer. There would be a long, dreaded silence, during which Rav Gershonson's fingers would begin to drum upon his desk or on his Talmud. "Nu?" he would ask quietly. "You do not know? How is it you do not know? Did you review beforehand? Yes? And still you do not know?" There would be another long silence, and then Rav Gershonson would look around the room and say quietly, "Who does know?" And, of course, Danny's hand would go immediately up, and he would offer the answer. Rav Gershonson would listen, nod, and his fingers would cease their drumming, and take to the air as they accompanied his detailed review of Danny's answer. There were times, however, when Rav Gershonson did not nod at Danny's answer, but questioned him on it instead, and there would then ensue a lengthy dialogue between the two of them, with the class sitting by and listening in silence. Most often these dialogues took only a few minutes, but by the end of September there had already been 2 occasions when they had lasted more than 3/4 of an hour. I was constantly being reminded by these dialogues of the way Danny argued Talmud with his father. It made it not only difficult to forget him, but quite impossible. And now it was also I, and not only Reb Saunders, who was able to listen to Danny's voice only through a Talmudic disputation. The hours of the Talmud class in the school were arranged in such a way that we were able to spend from 9 in the morning to noon preparing the material to be studied with Rav Gershenson. Then we would eat lunch, and from 1 to 3 we would have the actual Talmud session itself, the shiur, with Rav Gershenson. No one in the class knew who would be called on to read and explain, so all of us worked feverishly to prepare. But it never really helped, because no matter how hard we worked, there would always be that dreaded moment of silence when the questions could no longer be answered, and Rav Gershenson's fingers would begin their drumming. There were 14 students in the class, and each one of us, with the exception of Danny, sooner or later tasted that silence personally. I was called on in the first week of October, and tasted the silence briefly before I managed to struggle through with an answer to an almost impossible question. The answer was accepted and amplified by Rav Gershenson, thereby forestalling Danny's poised hand. I saw him look at me briefly afterward, while Rav Gershenson dealt with my answer. Then he looked away, and a warm smile played on his lips. My anger at him melted away at the sight of that smile, and the agony of not being able to communicate with him returned. But it was subdued agony now, a sore I was somehow able to control and keep within limits. It was no longer affecting my schoolwork. By the middle of October, everyone in the class, except me, had been called on at least twice. I prepared feverishly, expecting to hear my name called any day, but it wasn't. By the end of October, I began to feel uneasy. By the middle of November, I still hadn't been called on again. I took part in the class discussions, asked questions, argued, raised my hand almost as frequently as Danny raised his in response to Rav Gershenson's, "Who does know?" But I was not called on to read. I couldn't understand it, and it began to upset me. I wondered if this was his way of participating in Reb Saunders' ban against me and my father. There were other things, too, that were upsetting me at the time. My father had begun to look almost skeletal as a result of his activities, and I dreaded the nights he came wearily home, drank his glass of tea, spent some minutes with me in my room, looking hollow-eyed and not really listening to what I told him, and then went into his study. Instead of studying Talmud with him on the Shabbat, I studied alone while he slept. The Palestine issue was being debated now by the United Nations, and the partition plan would soon be voted upon. Every day there were headlines announcing new acts of terror and bloodshed. Every week, it seemed, there was another massive rally in Madison Square Garden. I was able to attend 2 of those rallies. The second time I went, I made sure to arrive early enough to get a seat inside. The speeches were electrifying, and I joined in the applause and the cheering until my hands were sore and my voice was hoarse. My father spoke at that rally, his voice booming out clearly through the public address system. He seemed so huge behind the microphones, his voice giving his body the stature of a giant. When he was done, I sat and listened to the wild applause of the crowd, and my eyes filled with tears of pride. In the midst of all this, Reb Saunders' League for a Religious Eretz Yisrael continued putting out its anti-Zionist leaflets. Everywhere I went, I found those leaflets, on the streets, in the trolley cars, in my classroom desks, on my lunch table, even in the school bathrooms. It became clear as November went by that the United Nations vote on the partition plan would take place sometime at the end of the month. My father was at a meeting on Saturday evening, November 29th, when the vote was finally held, and I listened to it over the kitchen radio. I cried like a baby when the result was announced, and later when my father came home, we embraced and wept and kissed, and our tears mingled on our cheeks. He was almost incoherent with joy. The death of 6 million Jews had finally been given meaning. He kept saying it over and over again. It had happened. After 2,000 years, it had finally happened. We were a people again, with our own land. We were a blessed generation. We had been given the opportunity to see the creation of the Jewish state. "Thank God," he said. "Thank God. Thank God." We alternately wept and talked until after 3 in the morning, when we finally went to bed. I woke groggy from lack of sleep, but still feeling the sense of exhilaration, and was eager to get to school to share the joy with my friends. My exhilaration was dampened somewhat during breakfast, when my father and I heard over the radio that a few hours after the United Nations vote, a bus on its way from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem had been attacked by Arabs, and 7 Jews had been killed. And my exhilaration was snuffed out and transformed into an almost uncontrollable rage when I got to school and found it strewn with the leaflets of Reb Saunders' Anti-Zionist League. The leaflets denounced the United Nations vote, ordered Jews to ignore it, called the state a desecration of the name of God, and announced that the League planned to fight its recognition by the government of the United States. Only the dean's threat of immediate expulsion prevented me from engaging in a fistfight that day. I was tempted more than once to scream at the groups of anti-Zionist students huddling together in the halls and classrooms that they ought to go join the Arabs and British if they were so opposed to the Jewish state. But I managed somehow to control myself and remain silent. In subsequent weeks, I was grateful for that silence, for as Arab forces began to attack the Jewish communities of Palestine, as an Arab mob surged through Princess Mary Avenue in Jerusalem, wrecking and gutting shops and leaving the old Jewish commercial center looted and burned, as the toll of Jewish dead increased daily, Reb Saunders' League grew strangely silent. The faces of the anti-Zionist Hasidic students in the school became tense and pained, and all anti-Zionist talk ceased. I watched them every day at lunch as they read to each other the accounts of the bloodshed reported in the Jewish press, and then talked about it among themselves. I could hear sighs, see heads shaking, and eyes filling with sadness. Again, Jewish blood is being spilled, they whispered to one another. Hitler wasn't enough. Now more Jewish blood, more slaughter. What does the world want from us? 6 million isn't enough? More Jews have to die? Their pain over this new outbreak of violence against the Jews of Palestine outweighed their hatred of Zionism. They did not become Zionists. They became merely silent. I was glad during those weeks that I had restrained my anger. I received straight A's in my college courses at the end of that semester. I also received an A in Talmud, despite the fact that Rav Gershenson had only called me once during the entire 4-month period I had spent in his class. I planned to talk to him about it during the intersemester break, but my father suffered a second heart attack on the first day of that break. He collapsed at a Jewish National Fund meeting and was rushed to the Brooklyn Memorial Hospital by ambulance. He hovered tenuously between life and death for 3 days. I lived in a nightmare of hallucinatory dread, and if it hadn't been for Manya constantly reminding me with gentle kindness that I had to eat or I would get sick, I might well have starved. My father was beginning to recover when the second semester began, but he was a shell of a man. Dr. Grossman told me that he would be in the hospital at least 6 weeks, and that it would take from 4 to 6 more months of complete rest before he would be able to return to his work. My classmates had all heard the news by the time the semester began, but their words of consolation didn't help very much. The look on Danny's face, though, when I saw him for the first time, helped a little. He passed me in the hallway, his face a suffering mask of pain and compassion. I thought for a moment he would speak to me, but he didn't. Instead, he brushed against me and managed to touch my hand for a second. His touch and his eyes spoke the words that his lips couldn't. I told myself it was bitter and ironic that my father needed to have a heart attack in order for some contact to be established, once again, between myself and Danny. I lived alone. Manya came in the mornings and left after supper, and during the long winter nights of January and February, I was all alone in the house. I had been alone before, but the knowledge that my father would return from his meetings and spend a few minutes with me had made the loneliness endurable. Now he wasn't attending meetings and wasn't coming into my room, and for the first few days, the total silence inside the apartment was impossible for me to take, and I would go out of the house and take long walks in the bitter, cold winter nights. But my schoolwork began to suffer, and I finally took hold of myself. I spent as much of the early parts of every evening as I could visiting my father in the hospital. He was weak and could barely talk, and kept asking me if I was taking care of myself. Dr. Grossman had warned me not to tire him, so I left as soon as I could, went home, ate, then spent the night studying. By the time my father had been in the hospital 3 weeks, the evenings had become almost an automatic routine. The dread of his possible death was gone. It was now a matter of waiting out the silence until he came home, and I waited out the silence by studying. I began especially to study Talmud. In the past, I had done all my Talmud studying on Shabbat and during the morning preparation periods. Now I began to study Talmud in the evenings as well. I tried to finish my college work as quickly as I could. Then I would turn to the passage of Talmud we were studying with Rav Gershenson. I would study it carefully, memorize it, find the various commentaries. Those which were not printed in the Talmud itself could always be found in my father's library, and memorize them. I tried to anticipate Rav Gershonson's tangled questions, and then I began to do something I had never done before with the Talmud I studied in school. After I was done memorizing the text and the commentaries, I began to go over the text again critically. I checked the Talmudic cross-references for parallel texts and memorized whatever differences I found. I took the huge volumes of the Palestinian Talmud from my father's library. The text we studied in school was the Babylonian Talmud, and checked its parallel discussions just to see how it differed from the discussions in the Babylonian Talmud. I worked carefully and methodically, using everything my father had taught me, and a lot of things I now was able to teach myself. I was able to do all of this in real depth because of Rav Gershonson's slow-paced method of teaching. And by doing all of this, I was able to anticipate most of Rav Gershonson's questions. I also became more and more certain of when he would call on me again. He had never called on me since that day in October, and now it was the middle of February. As a result of my night sessions with Talmud, I had pulled ahead of the class by at least 5 or 6 days, and was tangled in one of the most complicated discussions I had ever encountered. The complication was caused not only by the Talmud text itself, which seemed filled with gaps, but by the commentaries that struggled to explain it. The text consisted of 9 lines. One of the commentaries on the text ran to 2.5 pages, another ran to 4 pages. Neither was very clear. A third commentary, however, explained the text in 6 lines. The explanation was terse, clipped, and simple. The only thing wrong with it was that it seemed not to be based on the text it was explaining. A later commentary tried to reconcile the 3 commentaries by a method of pilpul, the result being a happy one for someone who enjoyed pilpul, but quite strained as far as I was concerned. It looked to be a hopeless situation. As we came closer and closer to this text, I became more and more convinced that Rav Gershonson was going to call on me to read and explain it. I didn't quite know why I was convinced of that. I just knew that I was. I began painfully to unravel the puzzle. I did it in 2 ways. First, in the traditional way, by memorizing the text and the commentaries, and then inventing all sorts of questions that Rav Gershonson might ask me. I would ride the trolley, walk the streets, or lie in bed, and ask myself questions. Second, in the way my father had taught me, by attempting to find or reconstruct the correct text, the text the commentator who had offered the simple explanation must have had before him. The first way was relatively simple. It was a matter of brute memorization. The second way was tortuous. I searched endlessly through all the cross-references and all the parallel passages in the Palestinian Talmud. When that was done, I had 4 different versions of the text on my hands. Now I had to reconstruct the text upon which the simple commentary had been based. I did it by working backward, using the commentary as a base, then asking myself what passage among the 4 versions the commentator could have had before him as he wrote the commentary. It was painstaking work, but I finally thought I had it down right. It had taken hours and hours of precious time, but I was satisfied I had the correct text, the only text that really made sense. I had done it this way only to satisfy myself. When Rav Gershonson called on me, I would, of course, only use the first method of explanation. When my father returned from the hospital, I would show him what I had done with the second method. I felt very proud of my accomplishment. 3 days later, we came to that passage in our Talmud class, and for the second time that year, Rav Gershonson called out my name and asked me to read and explain. The class was deathly silent. Some of my friends had told me earlier that they dreaded being called on for that passage. They hadn't been able to make any sense at all out of it, and the commentaries were impossible. I was a little frightened, too, but very eager to show off what I had learned. When I heard my name called, I felt myself tingle with a mixture of fear and excitement, as if a tiny electric shock had gone through my body. Most of the students had been waiting apprehensively to hear who would be asked to read. They had sat staring down at their texts, afraid to meet Rav Gershonson's eyes. Now they were all looking at me. Even Danny was looking at me, and from one of the students at my right came a barely audible sigh of relief. I bent over my Talmud, put the index finger of my right hand below the first word of the passage, and began to read. Every Talmudic passage is composed of what, for the sake of convenience, might best be called thought units. Each thought unit is a separate stage of the total discussion that makes up the passage. It might consist of a terse statement of law, or a question on the statement, an answer to the question, a brief or lengthy commentary on a biblical verse, and so on. The Talmud contains no punctuation marks, and it is not always a simple matter to determine where a thought unit begins and ends. Occasionally a passage will have a tight, organic flow to it, which makes breaking it up into thought units difficult and somewhat arbitrary. In most instances, however, the thought units are clearly discernible, and the decision on how to break up a passage into such units is a matter of common sense and a feel for the rhythm of the argument. The need to break up a passage into its thought units is simple enough. One has to decide when to stop reading and start explaining, as well as when to appeal to the commentaries for further explanation. I had broken up the passage into its thought units as I had studied it, so I knew precisely at what points I would stop reading and begin my explanations. I read aloud a thought unit that consisted of a citation from the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the written text of a rabbinic oral law. In form and content, it is for the most part terse and clipped, a vast collection of laws upon which are based almost all the rabbinic discussions, which, together with the Mishnah, compose the Talmud. When I came to the end of the Mishnaic thought unit, I stopped, reviewed it briefly, together with the commentaries of Rashi and the Tosafists. I tried to be as clear as I could, and acted as if I myself were teaching the class, rather than merely acting as a springboard for Rav Gershonson's comments. I finished the explanation of the Mishnaic text, and read the next thought unit, which consisted of another Mishnah found in a different tractate from the one we were now studying. The second Mishnah flatly contradicted the first. I explained the Mishnah carefully, showed why there was a contradiction, then read from the commentaries of Rashi and the Tosafists, both of which were printed on the same page as the Talmud text. I expected to be stopped at any moment by Rav Gershonson, but nothing happened. I continued reading and explaining, my eyes fixed on the text as I read, and looking at Rav Gershonson as I explained. He let me continue without interruption. By the time I was 4 lines into the passage, the discussion had become so involved that I had already begun to appeal to one of the medieval commentaries that were not printed on the same page as the text, but were rather placed separately at the end of the tractate. I kept a finger of my right hand on the appropriate place in the text, flipped the Talmud to where the commentary had been printed, and read from it. Then I indicated that other commentaries had offered different explanations, and I cited them by heart, because they were not found in the Talmud edition the class used. Having said that, I returned to the passage and continued to read. When I raised my eyes to explain the thought unit I had just read, I saw that Rav Gershonson had sat down, the first time since I had come into the class that he was sitting during a shiur. He was holding his head in the palms of his hands, the elbows on the open Talmud in front of him, and listening intently.